Welcome everybody to the 17th episode of the Paleoconnection. I'm Brandon and joined by Verv once again. Today we have quite a few topics to cover, including the recent killing of a black man being compared to George Floyd in Brazil. We also have some information on the Kraken, which has been trending on Twitter recently. As well as some COVID-19 mandatory vaccination news, and we'll probably round it out with a pro-life piece. First, we're going to talk about this murder, as it's being described in Brazil, of a black man who was beaten by security guards at a Carrefour, I believe is pronounced, supermarket in Brazil. It has recently hit the international news circuit, and I'm just going to briefly describe the events for you guys who do not know what this is about. So, a black man by the name of João Alberto Silveira Freitas was beaten to death by some security guards in the Carrefour supermarket in Porto Alegre, Brazil. The security guards punched and knelt on his back, and he reportedly said that he could not breathe, which is also similar to George Floyd. The accused guards have since been taken into custody and were arrested. And this all happened near the Black Consciousness Day, which is apparently a holiday in Brazil. Now, part of the reason why this is also very important is because there were subsequent protests that turned violent after the news went out that this man died. And from what I saw, there were reports of up to 1,000 protesters who verged on the Carrefour supermarket, and they made it inside and supposedly destroyed the inside and also lit a fire. There is a video of the man, João Alberto Silveira Freitas, fighting with the two security guards. I encourage anybody who is interested in this story to watch that video. However, like most videos related to subjects like this, we do not have the entire video, right? We do not have what happened before the video starts, which according to certain news sources, João Alberto Silveira Freitas actually started the incident by punching the security guards as they escorted him out of the supermarket. So we do not have video of that, although I have heard that it does exist somewhere. I could not find it on the internet. So we only have, let's say, the tail end of the video on this one. So, Verv, what are your thoughts about this incident?
It's interesting that this does not actually involve the police, but actually just local security guards, right? They're just working at the mall and, I guess, the supermarket, and this incident happens. And it's also, of course, very interesting that now the BLM narrative is in full effect, right? So it's been kind of a thing that you've been having these sort of anti-fascist and far-left demonstrations in Brazil, I'm sure going back a long time, but particularly they were going on when Jair Bolsonaro was running for the presidency in 2018. In fact, he was even stabbed and hospitalized temporarily because of an Antifa type attacking him. And as it appears, articles are stating that in July there were large-scale demonstrations after there were the deaths of two black Brazilians. There's been other incidents with a 9-year-old falling out of an apartment in Recife. So now there's this talk of Black Lives Matter in Brazil. Black people make up roughly 7.6% of Brazil, while self-identifying whites make up about half, and I guess 47% or so are the little bit more of the population identify as mulatto. So Brazil's quite a diverse country, not a super black country. 7.6%. So the idea that black consciousness is becoming a much more relevant topic to me has shown that Black Lives Matter is really growing powerfully internationally.
Yeah, I think the important point that you brought up there was that this was not law enforcement. These were security guards, right? That, typical security guards around the world have very limited training, and you wouldn't necessarily say that they represent the supermarket, and they certainly don't represent law enforcement. They're usually owned by private entities. And it's really hard to connect the actions of these two security guards to a greater, let's say, institution, that is responsible for institutional racism and whatnot, which is sort of the war cry in the United States whenever, a police officer, kills a black man. It's sort of, well, he's connected to law enforcement, which is an institution, and then it's claimed that they're racist, and then that's sort of where the attack is focused. But here, there's no obvious target for the protests. And one news source I saw said that they were chanting things like "murderous Carrefour," right? And I know I'm butchering that name, as it's a French supermarket name, but certainly, there is not, news stories daily about, security guards in Carrefour around the world, which is a global supermarket chain. Their security guards aren't murdering black people, right? So clearly what we have here is sort of like a one-of incident, like in the past where we would clearly hold the security guards responsible for their actions, and we wouldn't, expand this to some sort of institutional racism type of event. We would contain it and say, okay, these guys are responsible. They do not represent the supermarket. They do not represent law enforcement. They were the ones who acted in this manner. So that seems like what we have here. But again, BLM wants to, combine it with their greater narrative. And, you could also think that this is also combined with the greater narrative of the leftist movement against Bolsonaro in the country too. So it's the movement sort of, again, being co-opted. They just take an event that clearly was two security guards acting a bit inappropriately, or really inappropriately, depending on what you think, and then expanding it and blowing it up into something that it doesn't need to be blown up into.
Right, and it kind of shows the power of this narrative, because we're literally talking about a single supermarket in Brazil, and it's pretty newsworthy internationally. There's no shortage of English language articles, and all of them are now confronting it from this angle of racism, as if this could be the only explanation of it, when you got plenty of sources saying this was a fight that escalated, and the guy threw the punch himself, the first one. It makes me think that maybe this wouldn't be such a giant issue if Jair Bolsonaro was not the president of Brazil, just like how the George Floyd incident wouldn't have been that big of an issue if Donald Trump wasn't the president of the United States. I've begun to think that stories like this get blown out of proportion with the cooperation of journalists to apply pressure as much as possible to remove these guys from office, if at all they can. And so, in a sense, I think you could regard these incidents as something that the deep state of the U.S. and the American oligarchs and people in the West like to exploit to create these wedge issues to manipulate things in the direction that they want them to go.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the last point I'd like to make about this is that this is Brazil. Okay, Brazil is very well known for being a very violent society. So when you watch this video, it does seem, like the guards are acting inappropriately. I mean, they're throwing punches. That's something as law enforcement, you're not trained to throw punches. So I'm sure they probably weren't trained to throw punches either, but it seemed like it just turned into a sort of a melee, and they just started trying to defend themselves, through instinct, and they started throwing punches. But again, like I said, this is Brazil. This is a very violent country. Their homicide rate is 30 to 35 homicides per 100,000, which puts it in the top 20 countries in the world. They also, because it's quite a populous country, they have the highest number of gross total intentional homicides in the entire world, which the numbers I have here are 2018, which is over 57,000 intentional homicides, the highest in the entire world. Everybody knows if you take a vacation to Brazil, you need to worry about things like robbery, carjacking, kidnapping, lots of corruption. Of course, the favelas are world famous for their gang problems. The police carry, assault weapons or, rifles. They carry, frequently carry, they have to carry these guns because the people in the gangs and the favelas are very well armed. So we're talking about a country that is, dangerous and tough. And to see a fight like this might not be that abnormal to the citizens of Brazil. So I think we have to put this a bit into the context of the society and its very violence. Thoughts about that?
That's exactly right. With a society that has that high of crime rates, you can imagine that, things will get violent with not just the police, but with private security. And as, we've hit upon already, when you look at private security, obviously there's far different standards and lower expectations for what should happen and how they conduct the arrest. Regardless, hey, maybe we'll touch on this again in the future and get back to it. It's a very interesting topic, and I'd like to say thank you to Fabio for bringing that to our attention. Thank you.
Yeah, let me just say one more thing, because I forgot to give one more statistic, and I think this is also important because it is similar to the United States in that when you look at the homicide rate in Brazil by ethnicity, the homicide rate of black and brown people in Brazil is 37.8 per 100,000 people. And if you look at the homicide rate of non-black or brown people, it falls down to 13.9%. So similar to in the U.S., there seems to be a discrepancy between the different racial groups in that the black or brown people in the country are not only committing more homicides, but also committing more crimes. And therefore, just like in the U.S., they're going to have more contact with the police and so on and so forth. They're going to be looked at if they're in a store, they might be looked at with more interest as far as things like theft. And good reason. The statistics show, that they have a higher percentage chance to do and to commit crimes like that. So we have to also consider things like that. And I think, it's an important statistic to talk about.
A sad one, but very vital to contextualize anything that has to do with interaction between, crime and the security forces, and whether they're private or public.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So why don't you take us away with the next topic, Verv?
Excellent. So one of the things that everyone's been talking about is the quote-unquote Kraken. Honestly, I think it is It's a little bit silly, but it's also something that is to be taken quite seriously, because obviously getting information together to come up with a good case that voter fraud did occur is difficult. And moreover, you got to sit on some of these things and release them at the right proper moments. Many people are even saying that we've got two different teams in operation. In part of this releasing of the Kraken, so to speak, we've got the more normal team that's in close association with Donald Trump in his quest to win back the presidency, who are dealing with more down-to-earth stuff like obstruction of poll watchers and allegations that involve the mail. And then you have the team of Sidney Powell, who is dealing with really big picture type stuff. And you saw a week ago or so that President Trump's team kind of put distance between themselves and Powell. But many analysts are saying, no, these people are basically trying to do the same thing. They're just operating on different timescales, different timelines. We got those who are trying to make the victories right now to be able to get discovery, to get the right of discovery, as they would say in law, to be able to then get the evidence they need for the long-term voter fraud cases, and to get everything they need if they go to the Supreme Court. So it's really a complex series of things that are all happening. And we definitely can't cover it all, but we'll do our best to cover some of the key points that have been happening. First of all, one of the things that everyone should know about is the Brainerd report, which deals a lot with the mail-in ballot situation going on. Particularly, there's some very interesting results that came out of Pennsylvania, namely that nearly 33% of 1,706 Pennsylvanians asked never requested an absentee ballot, yet the state sent one to them. Additionally, about 40% of 1,137 Pennsylvanians who did request absentee ballots stated that the state didn't receive or count their returned absentee ballots. All these respondents were actually registered Republicans. So we're dealing with a situation where in Pennsylvania, we've got a huge number of people saying, that as Republicans, their votes were not actually being counted. Similar numbers hold up in places like New Mexico and Georgia and Arizona. Of respondents in Arizona, 50% said that the state did not record getting their ballot back. Georgia, 44%. Michigan, 32%. In Wisconsin, 20%. If these numbers really do hold out from these sample sizes that range from the hundreds to the thousands, if they hold up statewide, we're talking about a scandal of epic proportions. Many have said that this is definitely the Kraken. Other interesting information that has come out has been that thousands of mail-in ballots in places like Michigan and Pennsylvania were listed as having impossible return dates, or even being returned to the state before they were sent out. These can be viewed as just regular discrepancies, but these were things that slipped through and were counted in the end. So if we do have the opportunity to investigate all of these things, I'm sure that a lot more could be uncovered. Another really interesting angle comes from a professional named Dr. Eric Cannell. On a report on Revolver, he showed that there were very suspicious voter spikes in Michigan and Pennsylvania, and that they were only present in certain particular locales, and that rendered very unexpected voting results. Since these were not uniform across the state, it sort of points to fraud. In specific townships, there were massive increases that really outpaced what you would expect. For example, in Clark County, Michigan, the voter ratio had become 2.54 in 2020, which, if memory serves, was nearly double of what it was in 2016 of people voting against President Trump. These large voting spikes have been recorded in other places. A group called Voter Integrity, that's covering the election very well, has pointed out that these spikes have been absolutely instrumental in flipping these states for who they are calling President-elect Biden. So when you start to hear these numbers, let's get an example in our heads first. There is San Francisco, which is definitely the most famous liberal bastion in the United States. And over here, you can see occasions where a Democrat candidate will get 90% of the vote. But even in the bluest city in all of America, they never manage to get 95% of the vote. Yet we have instances occurring in these states that voted for President Trump last time, where batches of votes are coming in with 96% of the votes in favor of President Biden. It really cannot be emphasized enough how difficult it is to achieve something like that, especially considering that President Trump had a measurably better year with minorities than he did in even 2016. The study went over 8,954 different vote dumps, and of these, the first, second, fourth, and seventh most anomalous vote dumps occurred at crucial moments in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Georgia. To go over those very quickly, a 6:31 a.m. Eastern Time update from Michigan, which would have been 4 or 5 a.m. in Michigan, shows that it was a dump of over 150,000 votes roughly, and 96% went for Biden. Another dump in Wisconsin that was at 3:42 a.m. local time. It showed 143,000 votes for Biden versus 25,000 for Trump, and 83% going to Biden in this case. A dump in Georgia at 1:30 a.m. Eastern Time, 136,000 votes for Biden versus 29,000 for Trump, 79%. And another dump in Michigan at 3:50 a.m. Eastern Time, recorded 54,000 for Biden and 4,700 for Trump, which is a ratio of 86% for Biden. These are well above what you would expect, and they're happening in the tens of thousands, right? It's not a few thousand here or there. We're talking about, literally in some cases, nearly 150,000 votes going 96% in favor of President Biden, an absolutely ridiculous amount. Some of the more interesting things that have been coming up, there's absolutely an astounding amount of affidavits where Republican poll watchers say that they were being misled or in some cases encountered actual voter intimidation. There was a particularly interesting one in Pennsylvania where they talked about how when showing up to a vote counting location, they were not given access, and when they were, everything looked quite suspicious. In addition to this, there's the famous mailroom worker that James O'Keefe and Project Veritas brought up, who said that he had heard his boss talking about predating some of the votes that had come in. Now they are actually bringing charges. They want to bring charges against the man who interrogated him, and for witness intimidation. So they're saying that federal agents basically tried to get this guy into recanting his testimony. Moreover, we'll just touch on this more briefly. There was the interesting deposition of Andy Coomer, who was an Antifa endorsing worker for the voting machine company Dominion, who some say he joked about rigging the election so Trump could not win. Now, this is perhaps the more far-fetched thing, but on this topic, Sidney Powell's investigation has a report saying that there were actual decimal points coming in from the raw data feeds of Dominion machine election results, which indicate the presence of an algorithm at work, as in these machines were actively being used to siphon votes from Trump or to simply pump in votes for Biden, resulting in really strange information activity. Because, we're talking about one vote per person here. At what point are decimals introduced? So while a lot of people would say it's way too soon to talk about voter fraud happening in the machines, we actually have, in the big picture, Sidney Powell bringing up things like the Dominion machines not working properly, in addition to many other experts who have testified that these machines can very easily be tampered with.
Yeah, very well said there, Verv. I know you've been following this story a lot closer than I have, but at the end there, it sounded like you were bringing up again what we talked about in the past, this possible rumored CIA hammer and scorecard secret voting fraud program that they have, supposedly they've used on other countries. And some of the suspicions are that, and Sidney Powell is also the woman who mentioned this on Fox News with Lou Dobbs. She mentioned that she thinks that this algorithm, perhaps, or the CIA virus, or whatever you want to call it, was put into the machines and siphoned votes off or gave votes to Biden. One more thing that I wanted to mention was this sort of infamous story about a pipe that bursted in Georgia. Now, supposedly, there was a burst pipe in the counting area so in Georgia, they counted at Atlanta's State Farm Arena. That's where the counting was happening. And supposedly there was a pipe that burst. Water came in, and they had to shut down the counting of votes for 4 hours. Now, supposedly there are some text messages that recently were released that cast doubt on that claim. Supposedly, the delay was no more than an hour, not 4 hours, and it was quickly contained. So this, basically what the rumors are, that this 4-hour window where votes weren't being counted was the window where voter fraud happened, whether it be, again, through a CIA program or through, tampering with voting machines in another method, or just, doing it the old-fashioned way by stuffing the ballot box or what have you. This 4-hour period was the period where vote counting was down, and it would have provided the ample time for fraud to happen. And as you so eloquently put it before that, there were obviously these huge voting spikes that happened in Georgia. That was one of the states where the voting fraud would allegedly have happened. So this 4-hour stoppage of counting would have been perhaps crucial to give time for any of this voter fraud if they saw that the vote was going to be closer perhaps than they thought, or perhaps it was going to go towards Trump. It would have given them time to, perhaps change some things. Any thoughts on that, Verv?
I'm not surprised at all to hear that the pipe thing has been greatly exaggerated, and that it's being used, you could say, almost as a cover for whatever fraud may have occurred. I mean, obviously, we don't have definitive proof of these things yet, but this is the sort of thing that it's very hard to obtain proof of. And, there's enough suspicious activity that it makes it all the more suspicious overall. So, this is one of those things that it's you end up talking about it every single week. And this will be a very vital week for it as it continues through the court process. I'm just hoping that we'll be able to see the end of all of this, and that it just doesn't get squashed somewhere and the investigations themselves all dry up.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Eventually we'll have to stop talking about it. But on that note, we can move to the next topic, which is another thing that we constantly talk about, and who knows when we will ever stop talking about it. And that is, of course, COVID-19. So recently in the news, there has been a lot of information about a possible vaccine coming from various companies around the world. And thoughts are that perhaps sometime this month, before the end of the year, this vaccine will at least be out for the general public. I believe it's even being given to some certain groups in hospitals right now, vulnerable populations. But eventually it will be given to the general population. And the story here is that there are thoughts that it might become mandatory. And by this I mean mandatory to do things like travel on a plane, find employment. So getting a job at certain companies, they would require you to take this vaccine. And we have some interesting quotations here. This is from a Fox News story. And this is from a chief executive from Qantas. He goes on to say, this is Alan Joyce from Qantas, he's been talking to his counterparts at other airlines around the world about the possibility of what they call a vaccination passport for international travelers. He goes on and further says, we are looking at changing our terms and conditions to say for international travelers that we will ask people to have the vaccination before they get on the aircraft. He told this to Australia's Network 9 television. South Korea, their largest airline, has a similar message in Air. Jill Chung, who is a spokesperson for Korean Air, said Tuesday there's a real possibility that airlines will require that passengers be vaccinated. She said that because governments are likely to require vaccinations as a condition for lifting quarantine requirements for new arrivals. So if you want to travel around the world, you will have to take the vaccine. There is another story from NPR that goes on to say, quote, the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration has stated that employers can legally impose a flu vaccine requirement on their workforce, but employees have the right to request medical or religious exemptions under federal anti-discrimination laws. Each claim must be evaluated on its own merits, a time-consuming process for employers. So there is a legal precedent for private companies to require certain vaccinations. However, it does present certain problems. The article goes on to say, while it may be legal for employers to compel their workers to get the COVID-19 vaccine, doing so would be a huge, difficult undertaking, says Tony Yang, who is executive director of the Center for Health Policy and Media Engagement at George Washington University. He, in particular, has argued against mandatory COVID-19 vaccines because of situations like this. He says it's going to have lots of pushback, and lots of people are going to claim exemptions out of concern about the safety of the vaccine. We all know that this is a new vaccine. It's sort of been pushed, ahead of, normal, I would guess, normal vaccination research times. I think there's a lot of people that are skeptical about the vaccine. Of course, there hasn't been long-term studies on the possible long-term effects of taking the vaccine. We've heard reports of, 90 to 95% success rates, but again, we don't know what happens to people after they take the vaccine. It could be that the, cure is worse than the disease, for all we know. And then on top of that is, of course, the entire politicization of COVID-19, right? There's probably been no other virus or no other disease in the history of mankind that has been so political, wearing masks, not just in the U.S., but in Europe. There's been protests in Germany and other countries. And wearing a mask is not nearly as intrusive as being required to take a vaccination. And layer on top of that the whole anti-vax movement, which in recent years has sort of at least exploded in the media. If it, perhaps the actual population of people that do not vaccinate their children or themselves is maybe small, but within the media environment, it certainly seems bigger than it probably is. But you have people who will refuse to take vaccines for numerous reasons, whether they be political or religious or just, for health reasons. People might not be sure that it's safe. So it seems like there is this movement to require vaccinations, and we haven't heard any governments say that they're going to require it yet. But I wouldn't be surprised, places in East Asia like South Korea who would make it mandatory to be vaccinated. That would definitely have a big effect on me and Verv, as we both live in South Korea. So this is certainly a story that I think we need to watch, and it has the potential to kind of blow up once the vaccinations start happening, and once certain companies start making it mandatory, and then other companies sort of go along with it, and then everyone sort of just thinks that this is the way it needs to be done. You got to get on the bandwagon, and sooner or later we have governments requiring it. I'm interested to hear what your thoughts would be on this, Verv.
Right. So I think that one of the biggest issues is we're talking about a huge amount of people who just feel that they will not need it, and rather justifiably so, because we'll be talking about, an age range from 20 to 60. Very low risk of actually dying or it being lethal. You would think that, these people would have full control over their bodies. In fact, this has been a mantra of the American left in regards to the pro-choice movement. So, there's some ammunition there. And, speaking of ammunition, the United States is a country where you can legally own guns, right? So attempting to force vaccinize someone is never going to go over well. What is also interesting to me is the angle that one would be able to potentially take of saying that due to religious reasons you can't take the vaccine. Notoriously, we do allow adults to refuse life-saving blood transfusions if they like. So why not a vaccine? This would be something that I think will eventually produce groundbreaking legal cases that will make a lot of people upset on one side or the other. Personally, I think we should all generally believe in the science and vaccinate ourselves for the sake of not infecting older people. But then again, this is a really hard situation because who knows what kind of side effects could be coming down in the long term. They are passing this vaccine through emergency measures, right? These aren't going through the long-term studies that vaccines and medicine usually go through. And let's also remember that plenty of the medicines that have successfully gone through these things have led to epic catastrophes. Now, a good example of that would be OxyContin. However, they would say this is because it was prescribed too much and it has resulted in people killing themselves. And the real problem isn't the FDA, it's the doctors who are paid to prescribe it. But also just think about the fact that this is a drug so addictive that people do transition into hardcore narcotics abuse from it. So I think the FDA could do better. And when you think about it in the context of coronavirus vaccines, it gets a bit scary, does it not?
Yeah, that's right. I think you rightfully said here, the real danger, most likely at least in the United States, would not be a government-mandated vaccine, that would be a disaster. But the greater threat seems to be, like I said, a sort of perhaps bandwagon movement for employers, for schools, for airlines, where, in order to get a good job, you have to be vaccinated by COVID. In order to get into school, you have to be vaccinated by COVID. In order to travel, out of your state, by plane, you need to be vaccinated for COVID. So that's a potential threat there that companies, private, schools, and even perhaps public schools start mandating it, and others go along with it, and sooner or later, you're sort of isolated from society if you don't want to get the vaccine. So I think that's the real threat there that could potentially cause problems for, of course, I think most people would get vaccinated, but we've heard numbers of up to 40% of Americans saying that they would not get vaccinated by COVID for the COVID-19 vaccination. So there's still a large number of people who say they would never take it. And what are we going to do if 20% of the population refuses to take the vaccine? Are we just going to, have dual societies where, we have one group that doesn't have the vaccine and they have to get employment in certain, jobs, and then another group that does, and they can get employment in all the other jobs, and they could, travel. So it could end up being, quite a disaster. And as you said, there's going to be some landmark law cases here that will probably end up deciding it for us. With that being said, I think we should move on to the last topic. Would you like to take it away, Verv?
Definitely. So the last thing we'll be talking about is pro-life issues, and this honestly does relate a bit to what we were talking about just now, because we can look at a situation where you get these modern day sorts of scarlet letters. Just as someone who would refuse to take a vaccine, someone in the UK who is pro-life can end up wearing a proverbial scarlet letter as well. A midwifery student who faced suspension from her duties due to her involvement in the University Pro-Life Society just recently won an apology and a payout from her university, the University of Nottingham. What basically happened was in January of this year, university officials began an investigation of this woman, Julia Renkovitz, who at the age of 25 is a pro-life advocate and was head of the pro-life student union on her campus. During the 4-month-long investigation, they questioned her fitness to practice medicine or practice midwifery due to the fact that she is pro-life. These were concerns that her lecturers brought up, and no doubt many in the liberal camp who have nothing to do with medicine would have cheered on these accusations. This is honestly one of the scariest things you can imagine, being denied a total professional vocation because you don't agree with the pro-life versus pro-choice thing. If the opposite was true and there was a litmus test to make sure that there were no pro-choice doctors and nurses working in midwifery, you could imagine what kind of outcry that would have been 20, 30 years ago. But the case is that it's blatant discrimination against people who are pro-life. This hasn't really come over to the U.S. yet, but just wait and see.
Yeah, the good thing about this is it does have a happy ending, and the school was, forced to apologize, and she got a settlement out of it. But piggybacking off of this article, it got me interested to do a bit of an internet search if there's, similar discrimination practices against people who are pro-life. And I did find something, although it is a couple years old. It's something that I did not know, and that is that Justin Trudeau, the famous Prime Minister of Canada, put forth a policy that was very controversial a couple years ago. And that was, as the BBC says, Canada summer job grant applicants had to check a box on their forms stating they support human rights, and included in that was what they called reproductive rights. So what this was saying is that if you wanted to take part in this Canada Summer Jobs program, which is sort of a youth service where they provide, up to 70,000 summer jobs for people between the ages of 15 to 30, in order to get considered for that program on the application, you had to check a box, of course, saying that you supported human rights, but underneath this human rights, underneath what they encompassed as human rights was reproductive rights, and of course that means women to have an abortion. So if you did not check this box, you could not get a summer job in this program. And of course, religious groups and certain other groups, were outraged by this because, again, it's sort of, showing your allegiance to the cause. Please check this box. If you do not, we will not consider you for a job that could, of course, potentially give you experience and lead to a career in the same field. So it's clear discrimination against people who are pro-life. And furthermore, I think this is sort of the crux of the issue. Once you state that getting an abortion is a right, then it's impossible to go against that, right? Because you would just claim that people who are pro-life are against the natural rights of the citizen of that country. And once you start denying people rights, it becomes, a much more serious matter. Where if you just clearly state that getting an abortion is like a choice and it's not a right, then to be against it, is perfectly legitimate. But it's sort of a sneaky way to delegitimize the pro-life movement by saying if you're against abortion, you're denying someone their human rights, right? And how could you be against human rights?
Exactly. They're smuggling in the conclusion to their arguments. It's kind of like how I remember it was around 2014, 2015, shortly after the Obergefell ruling, there was some Al Jazeera interview in someone to say what their position is in the world of politics, referred to themselves as a human rights campaigner, which of course was a euphemism for a LGBTQ advocate. When someone says, "Hey, I'm an LGBTQ advocate," it has a much different ringtone than casting yourself in the light of being someone who defends human rights. And likewise, reproductive rights sounds a hell of a lot different than saying, "Hey, I'm just a pro-choice advocate."
Exactly. And, this is something we have to just, keep an eye on, because as these rights expand, the other one I'm kind of thinking of right now is healthcare. That's one of the things that a lot of liberals have said, is that healthcare is a right. And what that does, right, is it delegitimizes the other side of the argument, which says, no, it's not a right. But if you say, no, it's not a right, it makes you look, insensitive, right? That, you don't care about people's health, and that, you're in some ways, taking something away from them. So it's sort of a very sneaky way to, as you said, smuggle in what they want. And, by making everything a right, therefore the counter argument, just fails, on its face.
It's also just a distortion of the status quo, because what everyone has agreed upon in the Western world as fundamental human rights have always been enjoyed equally by people of all sexual persuasions. Obviously, there were instances of discrimination against gay people in the job market that existed before, but that is something that is being, perpetrated against Christians and also against, dissident right people today. There have always been instances of crimes being, gay people being targeted for crimes. These things were illegal 50 years ago. You couldn't just beat somebody up because you didn't like their sexuality or their political beliefs 50 years ago. The human rights that we've all agreed upon are something that we have worked for everyone to have. And calling yourself a human rights campaigner because you think everyone should have free health care or the right to marry is expanding the definition far beyond what it normally should be.
Yeah, it's very dangerous. The other thing I was thinking of was the right to have a job, right? This is sort of another thing that you apparently, or that you commonly hear leftists talk about. It's sort of a talking point, everybody deserves to have a job, and again, that's sort of expanding what we see as human rights, and eventually we end up with everything being a right. And then once everything is a right, as we said, the counter to that is just completely, disregarded, and there's no possible way you can be against human rights, sort of seen as the sacred, human rights are the new sacred rights for, leftists and for, atheists. It's like that's all they have, right? Is human rights, because there's nothing deeper beyond that. So they're sort of put on a pedestal, and you can't touch them. So as soon as everything becomes a human right, there's no longer any argument against it, and you can't touch it. It's just, solidified.
Right, and it functions as a sort of ersatz religion, as they would say. They don't believe in an afterlife. They don't believe in being rewarded for their personal virtues. So it's not, it's a pretty logical conclusion. Whatever their legacy is going to be would ideally be a big picture thing, and they want to improve the world. But the religious perspective is more of one where, the world can't necessarily be improved. Because of the way human nature is, you're just not going to be able to improve everybody. My closing thought on this, however, is even though they insist that they want to enshrine all these things as rights, look at how they treat the rights that we already have right now. Things like the freedom of speech, right? In the UK, France, Sweden, these are places where having the wrong opinion can actually put you in a jail cell. And of course, some of these are abhorrible opinions, but arresting people for them really takes away their status as a right. These are countries where things like homeschooling can be impossible. And these are places where, they'll tell you that you have a right to have a job, but if you're pro-life, they're not interested in having you function in the medical industry. So when they talk about a right, they don't talk about it in the same way a libertarian does, where this is an absolutely sacred thing that the government can't violate. To them, rights are a thing that you should have, but are also very much open to be regulated.
Yeah, that's a very good point. As you said, as they expand certain rights, other rights they seem to be contracting on. And, it only makes sense because if you do say, for example, that having an abortion is a human right, therefore you cannot speak out against that, right? So therefore certain, what you would say is freedom of speech in the past suddenly becomes restricted, right? Because you cannot be against those other rights that they have. You cannot speak out against those. So then it continues to narrow what you could possibly, be against and what you can possibly, say through freedom of speech. As we've often seen in the news recently, people have been shut down, giving speeches at universities and whatnot for having views that are, anti, gay marriage or, pro-family, anti-trans, things like that. So as the rights expand in the LGBTQ arena, it's only natural that you will not be able to freely speak out against it in the freedom of speech arena. So, sort of expanding in one way and contracting in the other direction. Yeah, I think that's a very good point that you made. And any final thoughts before we close this one, Verv?
Everybody have an excellent week, and thank you so much for listening. God bless.
Thanks for listening, and we will see you guys next time on the Paleoconnection.